Hello, warriors, and welcome to Wednesday. Welcome back to the live stream. I had some really crazy technical issues. Everything just dropped, so I had to reset up everything in terms of all of the multi places that you are finding this live stream, which you can find on Odyssey, on Rumble, and of course on YouTube for now. Going forward, we're going to have some exclusive content on Rumble and on Odyssey, not on YouTube, of course, because who knows, perhaps that's why I got cut off unceremoniously. But without further ado, I'm going to get into the chart of the moment, and then we're going to get into Freya, the Norse goddess of love, beauty, magic, and war, and some of the stories that surround her and her counterpart Venus. And we're going to look at specifically Venus and the moon as it comes to the chart of the everlasting now. So let's look at that. So as you can see here, maybe I can make it a little bit bigger. Let's see. That's slightly better, I think. So let's take a look at what we've got here. We've got Venus, I know for sure, is in Scorpio, as you can tell, if you're feeling intensely about things. Scorpio here is also opposite Taurus, which is my sun sign, and Taurus is ruled by Venus. There's always something to be said when you're looking at oppositions in astrology, because they're on an axis. So for example, both Scorpio and Taurus are fixed signs, and having Venus in Scorpio means that there is a deeper understanding, or we're going to be feeling things through when it comes to what's not necessarily seen. So before we get into more of that, because I think it's rather fitting that we're talking about Freya with with Venus in Scorpio, because there are two sides to Freya. There are two sides to these goddesses of love, but they also seem to, in terms of mythology, be goddesses of war as well. And what does love have to do with war? Well, if you think about ancient mythos, and myself and Kevin just watched Troy, and I'm going to get into the story behind that before Troy even begins, because that has to do with Venus as well, and the idea that because of love, people will go to war, right? If you think about even warriors, the dragon warriors, as I was saying before I was cut off, very crazy, that my guardian goddess in that Dragon Warriors saga is Freya, and it's also because I was really obsessed with She-Ra, and so I went through that whole spiel with my friend Arthi about how much I loved her, and like 80s version of She-Ra, I don't really recognize the new version. She doesn't really look like her at all. There's all of this detail in even her outfit, the 80s outfit, where she's got like the different I don't know what you want to call them, wings. Yes, they're wings essentially, like her winged helmet and her winged headband, and just how that is also attributed to Freya. And we're going to get into some of the symbology and how there's like counterparts behind different goddesses of love and beauty and war, and what we can do with that as it comes to our own placement of Venus and those aspects that exist within us, male or female, because we do have a male and female side that exists within us. And it's about also having those two parts of ourselves love each other, right? And the masculine version of yourself and the feminine version of yourself in you, even though you're expressing externally a certain gender. And we're going to get into that in a moment, because Freya is actually who taught Odin magic. But before we get into that, I got sidetracked, of course. I was just still crazy about what happened with like how it just conked out on me. Like, it's like my internet, like as soon as I was about to shift, it just was like, nope, you're not doing that anymore. But we are back. Can't stop us. All right, so let's look at the moon, because that's the other goddess that exists. Like, the sun is currently in Sagittarius, and we have a new moon, and the new moon is usually in the sign which is going to be coming up. So we have Capricorn season coming up. Christmas always falls around Capricorn season. That's how I remember it. And as we come into that time, the moon is going to move into full. Right now, also, Mercury is going into retrograde. Super fun time for all of us emotionally. But you can see right now in the stars, as I'm running the chart, it's we have a trine with the ascendant sign, and it's kind of fitting that I'm dressed as Samus. I'm gonna drop a link to my video about what the ascending sign means in astrology, and I get it. Like, you look at the wheel, you're like, what is going on in the stars? And if you think about when you were born, you have your very own starseed blueprint of what this looks like for you. And I look at it kind of like a video game, and Samus being the first lady of video games, it's about the character that you're choosing to play in this particular game of life. And the ascendant sign, since like learning astrology, like there's a lot of emphasis on our sun sign, right? The sign that the sun was in when you were born. And typically, if you look at horoscopes and stuff, you're going to be like, okay, that's my sun sign. And so it's a huge part of your whole makeup as an individual. But when it comes to the rising sign, and this is essentially like the time of birth, and it lays out the rest of your chart, because it's a wheel, it's time, and astrology is it's not like believing in anything. It's more about mapping out what is happening in the stars in such a way that we can interpret the energies, so that from a personal individual behavior, we're able to like move in accordance or in flow with what the cycles of time are. But yeah, so there's a trine here with the moon and Mercury. So Mercury is hanging out with the moon, and this is kind of nice. The Mercury and Hermes, Thoth, and the moon, the lunar goddesses. I did a talk on Warrior Goddess Wednesday last week about all the moon goddesses of the world, including Mayari, who's the Filipino moon goddess, but also Diana, and Isis is considered a lunar goddess as well, but Isis can also be attributed to Venus. So, but we'll get into how that kind of shakes out with like different stories in 2 seconds, before I just check out one last thing in terms of Venus making this opposition to, I guess it's not a complete like straight on opposition, but Venus is opposing Jupiter and Chiron. This isn't Chiron. Sorry, this is Chiron. I always get mixed up with those two because Chiron's the key. And Chiron is actually Achilles' teacher. Also, Hercules' teacher. So Chiron is a wounded healer. He was like accidentally injured by one of Hercules' arrows that was tipped in Hydra poison, but because Chiron's immortal, he can't die, and so he stays alive, so he's able to like heal and teach. But in our own chart, this indicates where we can find healing in this lifetime, healing in this life from the past, from past wounds, past grievances. And having this in Aries in a greater scale is all about us finding our inner warrior and standing up for what is right, having the courage to stand in your individuality and things that you stand for, having the North Node, the lunar node here as well. I think all of us on a grander collective level are feeling this energy right now. And going back to what I was initially trying to say about Venus opposing Uranus and Jupiter, let's look at this from a Sailor Moon perspective to describe it. I like to look at the planetary entities, the planetary luminaries, and the gods that embody them as like characters that are on this stage of the wheel. And so like if we look at the fact that Jupiter is like, yeah, Sailor Jupiter, and Uranus is Sailor Uranus, so an outer planet, more generational. Uranus is like the rebel. I've heard some accounts of some astrologers calling it more of like Prometheus. That's possible for sure, but definitely just about breaking new ground, being unusual, different, strange. It in Taurus is about usurping certain things like that. So and Jupiter is a Titan, but for a long while, uh, Jupiter is still the king of the gods, but it's ultimately still closer to Earth than the outer luminaries such as Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto, and Saturn. Really, Saturn's kind of there too, but Jupiter is like almost like that barrier between those two, in Sailor Moon at least. So she's part of the inner circle, and is a little bit tomboyish, the tallest one, but also like boy crazy too. So Jupiter and Venus are good friends, and both boy crazy. And so having them in opposition, you can find the commonalities between the two. This is a very harmonious opposition where sometimes these energies can fight against each other. But if we think of harnessing energies in an oppositional aspect, it's like creating like a battery here, right? And then like that's the idea of gender being part of magic, where like the opposing forces create something that is energetic between the two that is like net new and wasn't there before. So, and then yeah, it's cool. So this here too with Uranus, it's the same kind of idea that Venus is going to bring this element of beauty, love, sexiness, juiciness, especially in the intense sign of Scorpio. That is all about the sex, the occult, body language. And Scorpio is a water sign, and I find that I do gravitate a lot to water signs, just being someone who doesn't have very much of it. And if you want to know more about your elemental breakdown as like the type of superhero you're going to be playing here as per your astro, I will have an offering to that in the description. Okay, so that's it about the chart of the moment, or the everlasting now, in terms of what the goddesses are doing. We have the moon goddess doing her new moon thing, so empty cup, waiting to be filled. This is a good time to set goals. With Mercury going retrograde here, you may want to think about it being more goals that are interfacing. Like Mercury retrograde is nothing to be afraid of, but it's more about you're more likely to, in a retrograde, to be misunderstood. So like it's better to, in this phase, to work on things like communication and maybe have like much more like intimate conversations, but less of like the performance part of it. That can come perhaps a little later once Mercury goes direct, and depending on where he is in the moment. But moving along, let's get into Freya for Warrior Goddess Wednesday, our Warrior Goddess feature of the week, and my personal guardian goddess in the Dragon Warriors saga that I'm writing. You can read the one that I grabbed from Winnipeg, actually, in the link below. I have it being uploaded chapter by chapter as I interpret what my 14-year-old me is saying. But Freya, I loved Freya just because I thought that she was very similar to the archetype of what Shira was. But I'm just going to do a little overview here based on my fun tabs that I picked in terms of different stories that exist of Freya. The one thing I also love about myth is that there are always multiple versions of the same tale, and it doesn't make any of them wrong. Like even Troy, the Iliad by Homer, right? So that story was interpreted for the movie. I was like watching it with Kevin. I'm like, they removed all of like the god aspect of it. Like this is a good time to actually go into the commonalities between Venus and Freya, and then that'll go into Freya, because I'll tell the story of why Venus is even involved in the whole Troy thing. So Paris stole, like is in love with Helen, and Helen was already betrothed to the king of Sparta. So him well, I guess he did kidnap her and like took her to Troy, and this caused the whole war. But there's a whole backstory behind this. Paris was chosen by Zeus to judge this beauty contest between three goddesses, between Hera and Athena and Aphrodite/Venus. Now, Paris, being Paris, it's like apparently was like really good with women, and this is why Zeus liked him a lot. And I forget what he did before to like make him be worthy of this, but I think it's like a little bit of a trap if you think about it. Like you don't want to choose between goddesses like that. Although like you're gonna put the goddess of beauty in a beauty competition against goddesses. Anyways, the way the story goes is that these goddesses like stripped down for him and then made him certain promises. So Hera promised him all of Europe and Asia to rule. It's not bad. And then Athena offered Paris wisdom, and because like Athena is like the goddess of warriors, like prowess in battle, to be a great warrior. And then Venus, Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, offered Paris the most beautiful woman in the world to marry, to have. And Paris chose Venus, Aphrodite, of course, and she forgot to let him know that she was betrothed. So this whole thing came later, and then so because Paris was blessed by Venus, like he got away with all of this stuff. Like that war was always going to happen, and that's also like the connection between, you know, love causing war and like all of this complicated stuff that happens between the connection of men and women, right? Or that kind of thing. So how this is related to Freya is this: Freya Friday, the motifs of the Norse pantheon, if we think of that and we think of counterparts in different cultures, we find that there's a lot of commonalities between Freya and Venus. So for example, Venus, I call it Venus Fridays. Freya Fridays, that goddess is about Friday being sacred to her as that day. So that's also how now I'm going to get into Freya's story after that fun story about her blessing Paris's ability to take someone else's wife. But it's love, right? So one of the kings, King Priam in the movie said, like, you know, out of all things to fight for, out of all things to go to war for, better love more than, is a more noble goal than most, right? But when it comes to Freya, she's one of the principal deities of the Norse pantheon. The lovely and enchanting Freya was a goddess of blessings, love, lust, and fertility. A member of the Vanir tribe of deities, Freya shared her people's penchant for the magical arts of divination. It was Freya who introduced the gods to Seidr. I don't know how to pronounce this properly. Seidr, Seidr. It's a form of magic. I've read about this when I was learning about runes and casting runes and the power of runes, and it's known as like a form of sexual ecstatic magic in that as well. And it was Freya who taught this to the gods, and especially Odin, who became a very powerful user of this as well. It's a form of magic also that allowed practitioners to know and change the future. So this kind of form of divination having to do with fate. Freya was gentler and much more agreeable than the other Norse deities. Let's see here, the other Norse deities, where Thor accomplished his goals through aggression, very Mars-like, and Odin and Loki resorted to trickery. Freya achieved her ends with the gentler persuasions of gifts, beauty, and sex. And while Freya was often unselfish and helpful, she did have a darker side, as do most of our goddess friends. While Freya was often unselfish, and so like the male gods, Freya had a taste for blood and fought fiercely in battle. It was said she took half of the warriors slain in battle. And so if we think about Valhalla is actually Odin's domain for the warriors when Ragnarok comes, and Folkvangr is where Freya resides with her warriors. And so they would divvy up the warriors slain in battle and take them to these two afterworld locations. And Freya was known by a number of names, epithets, and variants of her name, like Freya, Freyja, all the different Freyjas with J's, and Froja, Froya. But there's also the idea of Frigg, because Odin is sometimes attributed as being married to a goddess named Frigg, and I think they say that here Yes. Some interpretations of Norse mythology believe Freya to be synonymous with Frigg, Odin's wife. And then there's also Gulveig, the vulva narrator of the Voluspa, who recounted the Aesir Vanir War and predicted the fate of the gods during Ragnarok. So I'm just going to get into that little war here because it's kind of important to kind of get where there's this idea of gods having tribes and like the war of the gods. And that's kind of also what the Iliad was talking about when Homer wrote it, because it's almost as if, I have to double check, that might be something to talk about next week, but the champions of the gods are also like mirroring the greater war that's happening on a higher dimensional scale. And that's kind of also what's going on in the Dragon Warriors, the idea of these different dimensions sitting on top of each other in density and then having multiple of them. And when things are happening, certain energetic interactions or stories being played out, it's happening on multiple levels. They're connected by a thread in some sort of way, and in many threads and in many ways. And so in Norse mythology, gods and goddesses usually belong to one or two of two tribes, the Aesir and the Vanir. And throughout most of the Norse tales, deities from the two tribes get along fairly easily, and it's hard to pin down distinctions between the two groups. But there was a time when that wasn't the case. So Freya is a Vanir goddess and was a practitioner of the art of cider, so the most terribly powerful kind of magic. It's interesting they use the word terrible, and if you think of Yggdrasil, the world tree, it translates to terrible horse. Terrible as a word might be something to look into a little bit deeper in terms of the etymology. Note that. So like historical cider practitioners, she wandered from town to town, plying her craft for hire. So like the wandering woman of magic. Under the name Hyder, meaning bright, she eventually came to Asgard, the house of the Aesir. And the Aesir were quite taken by her powers and sought her services. But as soon as they realized that their values of honor, kin, loyalty, and obedience to the law were being pushed aside by selfish desires they sought to fulfill with the witch's magic, they blamed Freya for their own shortcomings and called her gold greed and attempted to murder her. 3 times they tried to burn her, and 3 times she was reborn from the ashes. I didn't know this story, so that's a cool one. Because of this, the Aesir and Vanir came to hate and fear each other, and these hostilities erupted into war. The Aesir fought by the rules of plain combat with weapons and brute force, while the Vanir used subtler means of magic. This went on for some time, this war, with both sides gaining the upper hand by turns. And eventually the 2 tribes of divinities became weary of fighting and decided to call a truce. As was customary among the ancient Norse and other Germanic peoples, the 2 sides agreed to pay tribute to each other by sending hostages to live among the other tribe. Freyja and Norge of the Vanir went to the Aesir, and Heinir, pronounced Heinir, and Mimir went to the Vanir. I don't know how to say it. So in Asgard, Njord and his children seem to have lived more or less in peace, but the same can't be said of Honir and Mimir in the Vanaheim. The Vanir immediately saw that Honir was seemingly able to deliver incomparably wise advice on any problem, but they failed to notice this only when he had Mimir in his company. Honir was actually a rather slow-witted simpleton who was at a loss for words when Mimir wasn't available to counsel him. So Honir's ability to give advice was dependent on Mimir being there. That's interesting. This kind of goes to show how like Sigir kind of works as a magic. As Honir was responded to the Vanir's entreaties with the unhelpful "let others decide" constantly one too many times. The Vanir thought they had been cheated in their hostage exchange, so they beheaded Mimir and sent the severed head back to Asgard, where the distraught Odin chanted magic poems over the head and embalmed it in herbs. And thus preserved, Mimir's head continued to give indispensable advice to Odin in times of need. Oh, interesting. So they beheaded Mimir, though. That's okay. Well, that's interesting. We need to look back on this. So there's like a beheaded head that Odin looks to for advice that they sent back. But the two tribes were still weary of fighting a war that was so evenly matched, however, and rather than renewing their hostilities over this tragic misunderstanding, each of the Aesir and Vanir came together and spat into a cauldron. And from their saliva, they created Kasvir, the wisest of all beings, as a way of pledging sustained harmony. Oh, interesting. So, oh good, there's a pronunciation here to help. Kavasur is a being who is created by the Aesir and Vanir gods and goddesses at the conclusion of the war, and the war had ended with a truce. In the tail, the mead of poetry. That's kind of nice, because meads, I've tried to make my own mead once. I don't think that worked really well. Anyways, but whose storyline picks up where the Aesir Vanir leaves off. The deities sealed their peace treaty by coming together to produce an alcoholic drink by an ancient communal method. Everyone in the group chewed berries and spat out the resulting mush into a single vat. The liquid was then fermented, and in this particular instance, the fermented liquid itself became the god Kavasir, whose name is surely related, which means fermented berry juice, and the wisest of all beings. There was no question for which he did not have a ready and satisfying answer, so he took up the life of a wanderer, dispensing his wisdom to all whom he met along the road. When he came to the house of two dwarves, they killed him and drained his blood into 3 containers. They were called Deceiver and Screamer. They told the gods that Xer had suffocated from an excess of wisdom. Oh, and then they brewed mead by mixing his blood with honey, the mead of poetry. Oh, okay, so then now we get into this whole other... Okay, so I'm not going to get... This goes into some commonalities between the myth, between the Norse, even the mother goddess, I think Durga, is very much related to the Indian goddess. So that might be something to pick up with Arthi, with in terms of how her guardian goddess Shakti is related to Freya. That would be kind of interesting to look at. I'm going to keep a note on that. But I'm going to leave that here in terms of... I'm still not pronouncing this right. I'm going to call him Kvasir because he's supposed to be mead. But going back to Freya, yes, Folkvang. I was calling this Folkvanger, but Freya presides over the afterlife realm of Folkvanger, and according to the one old Norse poem, she chooses half of the warriors slain in battle to dwell there. So all of these stories also come in poetry. It's very interesting. And calling her a vulva, I like how this is also the vulva of a woman too. So if we want to think of this symbolically as well, and how this is also related to a lot of the sacral chakra, that energy system within your body. Cider is a form of pre-Christian Norse magic and shamanism that involved discerning the course of fate and working within its structure to bring about change, often by symbolically weaving new events into being. This power, could potentially be put to any imaginable use, and examples that cover virtually an entire range of the human condition can be found in Old Norse literature. And in the Viking Age, the vulva was an itinerant seeress and sorceress who traveled from town to town, performing commissioned acts of cider in exchange for lodging, food, and other forms of compensation as well. It's really interesting because there's tons of characters like this, like the traveling bard too, that exist in like RPG games. But other northern Eurasian shamans, her social status was highly ambiguous. She was sometimes exalted, feared, longed for, celebrated, and scorned. So like all of these different phases of even what the moon is like is kind of related to this. I wonder if you could consider Freya a moon goddess too. I don't think so. She's always like flaxen hair. That's how her name actually translates to lady. Freya's occupying this role amongst the gods is stated directly in the saga. I'm not going to try to pronounce that. And indirect hints are dropped elsewhere in the Eddas and sagas. So, for example, in one tale, we're informed that Freya possesses falcon plumes that allow the bearer to shift his or her shape into that of a falcon. So this relationship with falcon, that reminds me a lot of Isis, because Isis also has a winged cape that she lends out to the other gods when they need it. So it's a magical cape, and the whole relationship between magic and that goddess is very much counterpart. Before I get into more of the symbolic meanings of Freya and all the things that are related to her, because if you think of even certain crystals and other things like that, if you want to work with Venus and cultivate more love or involve that in your own personal rituals, I'm going to just leave those symbols in just a second. But before we get into that, there was a migration period between 400 and 800 CE and the period that preceded the Viking Age. The figure who would later become the vulva had a much more institutionally necessary and universally acclaimed role amongst the Germanic tribes. One of the core societal institutions of the period was the war band. So this idea of a war band, a tightly organized military society presided over by a chieftain and his wife. So this is like a different type of social structure that was very much like a tribe that has a chief and a wife. And then the wife of the warband's leader, according to Roman historian Tacitus, held the right of Valletta. And her role in the warband was to foretell the outcome of a suggested plan of action by means of divination, and to influence the outcome by means of more active magic, as well as to serve a special cup of liquor that was a powerful symbol of both temporal and spiritual power in the warband's periodic ritual feasts. Yes, and this is where it goes into Beowulf, which actually that would be a fun one to actually rewatch and give some notes for, because Beowulf is one of the oldest stories put to like written text, and the hero's journey in Beowulf is like the basis by which a lot of other stories can be told, and is a foundation for a lot of the symbolic meaning behind heroes' tales. And yes, because like she endows certain magic tools, and this is where it gets into like what it means to be a warrior goddess versus the warrior, because goddesses love their warriors because they are their champions to fulfill themes of beauty and love. And so it's like all of these things don't come easy. They come with certain effort and strategy and all of this juicy stuff, right? So with that, let's go into got into the little fermentation. So it's so interesting, like the chewing. I'm reminded of Dune with that, right? How they like spit into this stuff. Yeah, the mead of poetry. Yeah, Odin has eagle form too. I forgot about that. I already went into her as a vulva. We went into cider, and like what that is magic. Let's see here. Oh yes, the hidden connections that bind Venus, Freya, and Friday together. And so Lady Bird is a certain versatile Norse goddess, her Roman counterpart, and so like it's all kind of connected. So in most of Northern Europe, the word for Friday comes from a couple of Norse goddesses, Freya and Frigg, respectively, by the highest ranking deities of their warring pantheons, the Vanir and the Aesir. And in English, the name comes from Frigg, with the Anglo-Saxon spelling being Freyja, but in all other languages, equivalents like Friday, like Freitag in Germany, are commonly attributed to Freya. The two goddesses are often confused, and yeah, they're the same non-existent being. It says you. It's a nice little image. And so Freya and Frigg are the rough Norse equivalents of the Roman goddess Venus, who gives her name to many Romance languages of our variants of Friday. Vendredi is the French version, Vendredi. Indian languages follow suit with the name Shivakavar, derived from the Sanskrit word for the planet Venus, Shukra. Oh, okay. So there's that other connection there. So Freya is not only the Norse equivalent of Venus, but also of the Virgin Mary. An easy connection between the two can be found in the humble ladybird, a name which is the contraction of Our Lady's bird, while the Germans know the insect as Mary's beetle, Marienkäfer. However, before the early Christian missionaries came calling and did their level best to wipe out all traces of indigenous pagan practice, the ladybird was known either as, oh my gosh, Freya's chicken, which is curiously also the Old Norse name for the cluster of stars that we now know as the Pleiades or Seven Sisters. I did not know that. That is so crazy. We just all discovered that together, because I did a whole presentation on the Pleiades and the Seven Sisters, who are the daughters of Atlas and Atlantis. Oh my gosh, what a clue. Didn't even realize. Thanks, Freya. Okay, now Freya's powers and symbols. We're gonna do this, and then we're gonna wrap up this talk, because I went on a little bit longer than I thought, just because of that beginning hiccup with the live stream. But Freya's powers and symbols. So Freya, the goddess of beauty, love, fertility, and magic, is known for her extraordinary powers and symbols in Norse mythology. Let's explore the fascinating aspects that make her a powerful and captivating goddess. So shape-shifting, that's the first one. Freya has the ability to shape-shift into different creatures, including a bird or a falcon, to aid her in adventures and quests. And this can counter with Odin, because Odin transforms into an eagle, which I've seen there, and also other things as well. Birds are very important. And also birds are representative of air signs and the heart. Keep in mind with all that when it comes to things like love, because when you have the shadow side of it, where like love becomes possession and obsession, and having Venus and Scorpio, that's a beautiful lesson for anyone who I've expressed this as well too, where like love becomes this like consuming thing, where like I need to have you and only I have you, I can't share you. But that's not really the way love works. Love is freeing, it is light, it is open, right? So falcons and cats. Freya is often depicted with a falcon or a pair of cats who pull her chariot, representing her power and connection to the animal world. So, I mean, like I brought that up with Shira twice, or like she talks to animals twice. She's got this necklace of bruising and oh my gosh, it's her most prized possession. It was created by 4 dwarves and has magical powers. It's said to bring her protection and fertility. And Freya is also the mother of Balder. And Balder is like the golden child, very much symbolically counter to Horus and to, oh my gosh, well, Christ, of course, as well. But like, yeah, exactly. So like this idea of Galahad, that's what I wanted to get at. The son of Lancelot, who was the one who was destined to find the Holy Grail. So this idea of the mother goddess being this magical wife goddess is the mother of like the sun falcon, that kind of thing. And so then that's also connected to falcons and cats, right? So the necklace, love and fertility, I got into that. She is the goddess of love and fertility, so she blesses couples just like Venus. And so like couples would pray to her to break any curses of infertility so that you're able to conceive a child, right? And if we think of things like vulva and all that like female sexy stuff, like, you know, like the sex what do you want to call it, like the herb woman who you would go to like give you like a paste to put on to like rebalance things out. And magic here, where she's known for her expertise in magic, particular cider, which involves divination and the manipulation of reality through spells and trance-like states, so ecstatic trances. So those are just a few of the symbols that are made, and if you can see there by like the power of those symbols how there are counterparts in other goddesses. It doesn't matter if you as a woman or whoever you choose to reach out to as a thought form or symbolic character of inspiration. I'm going to get into Odin just quickly because there's a saying that like Odin is the only other god in the pantheon, in the Norse pantheon, who could rival Freya in her use of magic. And Odin is known as the All-Father, ruler of Asgard and the most powerful of the gods. He embodies wisdom, war, death, and poetry, and he's also revered for cunning and strategic thinking. So there's also this idea in the gods of like being crafty, and this is why like even in American gods, that main conflict is between Loki and Odin. And where goddess Woden's Day, Odin's Day. I was born on a Wednesday, so this is how that saying, Wednesday's child is full of woe, but you're just aware maybe of a lot of too much stuff. So like this appetite for knowledge and relentless pursuit of that, if we relate that to, you know, seeking and seekers, and if knowledge and Sophia and the earth of like the full nature and knowledge of all and seeking that, it's all related. And the clues in our own personal charts, how we're living out this existence, can get clues from the greater cosmological plays and operas that are happening all the time. Now, before we close, this whole idea of cider magic, it's this idea of storytelling, right? And this idea that magic can come with it a little bit of a taboo. So I'm gonna like end my show with this little like lesson of what Freya can teach us as a warrior goddess, and cultivating inner strength in our pursuit of beauty and truth, freedom and love, and being aware of the higher vibrational aspects of love. And this even goes back to when I was talking about the happiness hormones, and specifically the hormone oxytocin, which is the hormone that is the love and trust and bonding hormone, but it also breeds things like jealousy, you know, like when I remember in like high school and stuff, you know, like where you'd break up with a guy and then you would like go to the dance, and then like you dance with other guys, like make him jealous. But it's like these stupid childish games. But that all comes from like why we do that comes from a place of it's because you care, right? You obviously like you had a relationship, you built a bond, and now you don't it hurts, right? So it's working through all of that that's involved with love. And it's this idea that it, Achilles said that, right? That the gods envy us because everything is so fleeting. We are living out this existence, this material world existence, within a container of time. And so with that, you get a feeling of specialness, of true beauty, because it's exquisite, and in a sea of infinite, it's just this one that's unique and only you. And that's why it's, I think, important to know thyself, to leverage your own birth chart. Like since learning astrology, like I still look back at like certain things you like know, and then you learn more about it because you get a new lens and you get a new perspective. It's no different than going back and watching a movie with new eyes, like a movie like you watch when you were like 10, and then you watch it when you're 20, and then watch it again maybe after you break up with someone. It's all different eyes, and the magic really exists in you. And when you have these tools, and so talisman, whatever it is that you're working with to generate magic, or in this case fate, it's all about like what we're able to do in the now to influence what's going to happen, because what's going to happen is already happening as soon as you envision it. It's that quick. It happens that quickly. And so that's why it is important to take care of your thoughts. That is also related to the moon, because the moon emotions are still mental. And what Venus and Freya can teach us is the deeper inherent knowing that is beyond the mental, that the mental can pick up and pull in and synthesize and then pull back out to express. So it's like this wonderful dance of both the masculine and feminine within us, as well as the unconscious and conscious as well. And I think that that's the true magic of realizing what stories that we're in, and that's really how astrology helps. And Samus is like being your navigator through space. Astrology and your astrologers, whomever you choose to listen to, whatever their lens is that we're all looking at this map, and based on our lenses we can interpret what's going on as a whole, because we're all pieces of it. We're all that fractal, but also the all. And we do still owe it to everyone else that's playing this game of life to be expressing out what we are truly supposed to be expressing in this lifetime. And even as we go up to bat against what seems like larger cosmic forces, we also have the ability to wield that as well. But it's about coming correctly to ourselves. Yeah, I think that's a good way to end it. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Warrior Goddess Wednesday, where we went over the Norse goddess Freya, the goddess of love, beauty, and war, as well as magic. And we went through the chart of the everlasting now with just that lens of the goddess on it. If you would like to support the show, I have a little QR code there just underneath the wizard to get us some mushy to support Golden Sugar. We're going to have a lot more live stream cosmic conversations coming up. And if you want to ensure that you're staying up to date with all of that, we have a link to our newsletter, which you can get in the description and the show notes. So I hope you have a beautiful evening wherever you reside in the cosmos. Until next time, Starseeds.